Today's meeting covered a wide range of topics, including ongoing discussions on transgender athletes and the continued hate and vitriol directed at players online. There are no immediate eligibility matters affecting the WNBA. Yes, there are. And we strongly denounce the bad faith efforts to use these topics to demean or marginalize others. In other words, we have no idea how to handle this.
Well, they say there's no matters at hand they have to deal with. There are.
Yes, true.
Because with Enes Kanter and Royce White declaring their eligibility, right. I looked through the 409-page plea bargain, basically sort of constitution that the WNBA has. And it says that to be eligible, you have to be a, quote, woman.
One statement about transgender athletes joining the WNBA has opened a debate the league may not have expected. What looked like a simple defense quickly turned into a much louder argument, with fans questioning where the league draws the line and what this could mean for the future of women's basketball. But there is one part of this controversy that has barely been discussed yet. What happens if the debate reaches the players themselves?
The WNBA, which says, some of their coaches have been saying, that men who identify as women should be eligible to play in the league. Okay, now there's a French superstar, 21 points she's averaging, and by she I mean he, 20 rebounds a game. Okay,
I want to tell you what's going to happen when the Democrats get back in office. You know what's going to happen? The transgenders are going to sue. They're going to sue the WNBA for gender-based discrimination under the 1964 Civil Rights Act that our ancestors fought for. Here we go again. Barack Obama appropriating black justice for white gays. Here we go.
The WNBA was supposed to be celebrating basketball, but somehow the league has found itself starring in a political drama that feels less like a professional sports season and more like a Netflix series that keeps getting renewed because nobody knows how the next episode is going to end.
Meanwhile, Sophie Cunningham, because of the statements that she made about biological boys playing in women's sports, she is getting booed on and off the court. People are being even more aggressive towards her. Anti-trans and pro-trans protesters are now facing off at games, literally inside the arenas and outside beforehand. Meanwhile, at every single interview, players are getting hounded to give their opinions. And then, of course, you have the coaches. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but Indiana Fever coach Stephanie White, I believe her name is, she seems completely disconnected from her players, Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham. Sophie Cunningham is going through all these things. Obviously, Caitlin Clark has been attacked and vilified for years now, and Stephanie White has nothing to say about anything.
Now, the latest controversy involves transgender athletes, with the league defending inclusion and insisting that the conversation should be handled respectfully, while critics are asking a much simpler question. Where exactly does the WNBA draw the line?
The girls were holding signs supporting Sophie Cunningham following her comments about transgender participation in women's sports, and the WNBA ruled that the interaction violated its fan code of conduct, the Storm issuing an apology for the incident afterwards. Sophie, without sort of revisiting the actual issue that brought us to this point, I would just love if to get your thoughts on the league's discipline of an owner over a fan interaction.
Yeah, I think I have a very clear and strong perspective on this. With that being said, though, I think I know that people are not always going to align and agree. I totally understand that.
And before this story goes any further, there is one important fact that gets buried underneath all the outrage. There is currently no transgender woman playing in the WNBA, and there has never been a player who was male at birth competing in the league. The controversy is about eligibility, policy, and what could happen in the future, not about a current transgender player taking somebody's roster spot.
There are men now threatening to join the WNBA, blatantly proving that women were right to choose the bear. Also, a bunch of Sophie Cunningham. So, before anybody gets confused, it's not the setup to a joke about the NBA finally discovering women's basketball. Former NBA players, Enes Kanter, Freedom, and Royce White have recently announced that they intend to declare for the WNBA draft, arguing that if the league is going to allow players to identify as women, then apparently they should be allowed to play too, right? So what it is it sounds like these guys are making a statement on transgender women, but they're not.
That distinction matters, because the WNBA's current collective bargaining language says only players who are women are eligible to play. But the league's rules do not clearly spell out the detailed definition of who qualifies under that wording. That lack of clarity is exactly what has allowed the argument to explode. Supporters see an opportunity for inclusion, while critics see a policy that could eventually create questions about competitive fairness in women's basketball. And that brings us to the part that has people scratching their heads. Why is the WNBA even having this conversation right now? The answer is that the issue did not suddenly appear out of nowhere. It has been building for years, but in 2026, several events pushed it directly into the middle of the league's already chaotic spotlight. The latest explosion followed comments from Indiana Fever guard Sophie Cunningham. Then the WNBA stepped in. And this is where the situation became even more interesting. The league did not announce that a transgender athlete was joining the WNBA. It did not announce a new player entering the draft. It did not reveal that a biological male had been signed to a roster. Instead, the league responded to what it described as bad faith efforts to provoke controversy around transgender participation and said there were no current eligibility issues involving transgender players.
NBA facing a culture war sparked by Sophie Cunningham. So the Indiana Fever Guard's mission to, quote, protect young girls in the locker room has become a right-wing flashpoint, so much so that two former NBA players are declaring for the 2027 WNBA draft. Ness Cantor and Royce White both say they suddenly identify as women. Now, White even unveiled a new wig, saying he's in his feminine era. Now, I just want to be clear, no openly trans woman has played in the WNBA. League policy simply states that only women are eligible.
In other words, the WNBA was essentially telling everyone to calm down, but asking the internet to calm down is about as effective as asking a basketball to stop bouncing. Instead of disappearing, the controversy continued to grow because once a conversation about transgender participation enters the world of professional sports, it rarely stays confined to the basketball court. The league's anti-hate task force discussed the issue. If the league believes inclusion should remain a central principle, what exactly would its eligibility standards look like? Would there be specific medical requirements, competitive considerations, or different standards depending on an athlete's circumstances? More importantly, would those rules be written clearly enough that players, coaches, teams, and fans would know exactly where the boundaries are without having to decode them like the terms and conditions on a phone contract that nobody reads? Those questions matter because professional sports are not simply social institutions where participation is determined by personal preference.
Of having that respect, having that love, and pursuing peace in these conversations, in these debates, because I think that is healthy. Now, with that being said, I just hate how the basketball of it all is just getting overshadowed. I think that you are seeing teams playing at the highest level they've ever played at. You see great basketball, the most elite level basketball this league has ever seen. And it just makes me sad that all this kind of drama and things that truly don't matter are getting overshadowed. The basketball is getting overshadowed. And so my biggest thing is love and respect. I think there's room for absolutely everybody. We don't always have to agree, but that respect and love definitely has to be there.
They are competitive environments built around eligibility rules, physical competition, player safety, and standards intended to create a level playing field. That is precisely why the transgender debate has become so emotionally charged, because people are not merely arguing about identity or politics. They are also arguing about how fairness should be defined inside a competitive women's league. And somehow, that is only one chapter in the WNBA's current controversy machine. While the league is dealing with questions about a hypothetical future eligibility issue, it is also facing controversies that are happening on the actual basketball court, and few players have been closer to the center of that storm than Caitlin Clark. Clark has almost become the human equivalent of a breaking news notification, because whenever something happens around her, somebody has an opinion, somebody has a camera pointed at it, and somebody is already preparing a social media argument before the final whistle has even sounded. The physical treatment Clark has received on the court has become one of the recurring debates surrounding the league, particularly among fans who believe officials have not done enough to protect her from hard contact. That conversation intensified after an incident involving Phoenix Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas, when Thomas made contact with Clark around the neck area without an immediate foul being called or the play being reviewed at the time.
WNBA leadership announces they're having an emergency meeting to discuss what they're going to be doing with the W and WNBA. We have to identify what it is. Literally, they put a task force together to discuss the growing drama around transgender athletes because they got humiliated. They got humiliated by not taking a position. All they have to do is, Vinny, make a position at the top to say where they stand, and it would have been done with. But every single time you're hearing Caitlin Clark in interviews like, can we just talk basketball?
Now, whether every hard foul against Clark should be classified as intentional targeting is a completely separate question, because proving intent requires more than simply watching a physical play and deciding that it looks suspicious. Basketball is an aggressive sport. Defenders make mistakes, players collide, and sometimes a hard foul is exactly that, a hard foul. However, perception has become almost as important as the play itself. If fans believe officials are protecting the integrity of the game and applying the rules consistently, they are more likely to accept difficult calls, physical competition, and controversial moments as part of professional basketball. If they believe certain players are being treated differently or that dangerous contact is being ignored, then every subsequent foul becomes another piece of evidence in a much larger argument. That is, expansion has created even more excitement about the future of women's basketball. The WNBA has genuine momentum, and there is no denying that the league is in a dramatically different position than it was several years ago.
Charles, what about if the WNBA, let's say, for example, they were willing to take it as ridiculously far as you just intimated, and they were declared ineligible for the WNBA draft. From a legal perspective, what's the strongest legal argument Enos Cancer Freedom and Royce White could make?
I mean, they would have to try to play some game of charade of decrying discrimination on in some way, shape, or form, sex discrimination. I mean, I think
somehow the conversation can change completely from one day to the next. One moment, everyone is talking about a major game or a spectacular performance. Then the conversation shifts to officiating, before moving to Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, player safety, political arguments, transgender eligibility, or another controversial incident that suddenly dominates social media. At times, the WNBA seems to have discovered an accidental marketing strategy in which nobody knows what the next headline will be, but everyone is somehow guaranteed to have an opinion about it. That is why some critics have started describing the league as being more about drama than basketball. That description is obviously exaggerated because basketball remains the foundation of the WNBA. The NFL has controversy. College sports have controversy. Even golf occasionally manages to create enough drama to make people forget that the objective is still to hit a tiny ball into a hole. The real problem begins when the controversy becomes more recognizable than the competition. That is the territory the WNBA needs to be careful about entering.
As we have to protect women's basketball from biological men, the obvious question is, from who? It's actual men, So is anybody playing in the WNBA right now who wasn't assigned female at birth? No, there's nobody. There's not a trans player dominating the league. There's not a trans player taking somebody's roster spot. There's no trans player destroying the competitive balance of the WNBA. The WNBA is discussing transgender eligibility policy because the issue has become politically and publicly controversial.
Consider Sophie Cunningham as an example. Her career has suddenly intersected with several completely different conversations. Her comments about transgender participation attracted significant attention, while her physical style of play and public defense of Caitlin Clark placed her at the center of another debate surrounding the league. Then came political reactions, protests, arguments on social media, and responses from the WNBA. Suddenly, a professional basketball player who should primarily be discussed in terms of shooting, defense, rebounding, playmaking, and team performance was being discussed across political media. That is not necessarily Cunningham's fault. It is what happens when professional athletes become participants in broader cultural arguments, and the WNBA has been willing to engage with those cultural conversations for years. The league has openly supported LGBTQ plus advocacy and inclusion initiatives, and it has a history of positioning itself as a progressive professional sports organization. The WNBA has also had players who publicly identify as transgender or non-binary, including Laishia Clarendon, whose story demonstrates why the current debate is more complicated than simply claiming that the league has decided to allow men to play women's basketball. That distinction is critical.
She didn't have to do this. And I think that's what people need to understand here is Sophie is already successful. She's already an incredible athlete with a great platform. She could have easily stayed silent or quiet on this issue like so many other female athletes have. And honestly, I think that would have probably been the safer decision in this case. But We've seen what happens when women stand up and speak up about this issue. There's often a lot of criticism and immediate consequences that follow. People questioning their...
The WNBA has not suddenly transformed into a league where biological men are currently competing against women. What it does have is a growing debate about how its eligibility framework should be understood and whether its policies are sufficiently clear. And ironically, that makes the controversy even more interesting, because the battle is taking place before the hypothetical player has even arrived. The league is essentially arguing over the rules of a game that has not happened yet. That means the WNBA has an opportunity to settle the confusion before it becomes an even larger problem. If the league wants to emphasize inclusion, it needs to explain exactly what that means within a professional women's basketball competition. If it wants to prioritize competitive fairness, it needs to explain how that principle will be applied. The longer eligibility standards remain unclear to the public, the easier it becomes for different groups to fill in the blanks themselves. Supporters may assume the league is moving toward broader inclusion, while critics may assume the league is preparing to remove traditional boundaries surrounding women's competition. When both sides believe the other is hiding something, trust disappears quickly.
The WNBA is insulated in a lot of different ways as a private organization in terms of who it does and does not allow to participate in its sports league. And so from a civil rights perspective, even if they were to entertain that, they would have to establish their membership in a protected class. Federally speaking, transgender people have not been designated a protected class, but there is a way to get to that sort of legal theory by way of sex discrimination. They, to my knowledge and to everything that they've put out, have not yet undergone any sort of gender dysmorphia treatment.
Meanwhile, there is still an actual basketball season happening. Caitlin Clark still has games to play. Sophie Cunningham still has games to play. Teams still have playoff ambitions, players are still competing for championships, and fans still want to see who can actually put the ball through the hoop when the game is on the line. That should be the center of the story. Instead, the WNBA has reached a strange point where a conversation can begin with a hard foul, move into Caitlin Clark, somehow involve Sophie Cunningham, take a detour through transgender sports, and eventually end with people arguing about politics. Controversy can generate clicks, but championships create history. Social media arguments can dominate an entire weekend, but great basketball creates fans who continue watching for years. And the WNBA has something far more valuable than controversy sitting directly in front of it. The league has elite athletes, emerging stars, established legends, expanding markets, unprecedented attention, and a growing generation of fans discovering women's basketball in numbers that would have seemed almost impossible a decade ago. That is the opportunity the league cannot afford to waste.
Down to two things: fairness in women's sports and inclusion for transgender athletes. Both are important. The difficult question is, how do you balance the two? Let's start with the science. Researchers generally agree that going through male puberty creates average physical differences. Things like height, muscle mass, strength, bone structure and density, and cardiovascular capacity. Hormone therapy can reduce some of those differences, but the scientific debate is whether those changes eliminate enough of the advantages associated with male puberty to create fair competition in every...
The question is not whether the WNBA should allow itself to have difficult conversations, because every major institution eventually has to confront difficult issues. The real question is whether those conversations can happen without drowning out the sport itself, and that is where the league needs to be careful. The WNBA does not need to eliminate controversy, it needs to prevent controversy from becoming the main attraction. Caitlin Clark should not need to be involved in another hard foul for people to pay attention to the league. Sophie Cunningham should not need to become part of a national political argument for people to know who she is. And transgender eligibility should not become a permanent headline before the league has even clearly established what its future eligibility standards are. When the drama becomes bigger than the basketball, however, the league risks reinforcing exactly what its harshest critics already claim, which is that the latest controversy can become more important than the latest game. And now the biggest questions are sitting directly in front of the WNBA. Can the league settle the transgender eligibility debate without creating an even larger controversy? Can officials convince fans that player safety and officiating are being handled consistently? Can Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, and the rest of the league's stars receive attention primarily for what they accomplish on the court? And perhaps most importantly, can the WNBA prove that the drama is surrounding the sport rather than slowly becoming the sport itself?